Thanks very much for coming. We will go ahead and get started. We've got our panelists, we've got you. So it's a great morning. I appreciate you being here as opposed to outside where it's beautiful. Wireless access, let me know if you can't see this. If you want to tweet anything out, if you could also tweet at Orrick TA for total access. Normally, Chad Lynch, who is our Director of Business Development, would be here. He's unavoidably detained this morning, so he usually makes some sarcastic joke about lawyers and me. Those kind of write themselves, so I'll just let you free associate and come up with your own bad lawyer jokes. Well, I will let the panelists introduce themselves, but for those of you who have been here before, we do panels a little bit differently than most. We actually start after the introductions. I take questions from you guys first. We don't do the answers, it's the Q section. And then I'll take the questions and I'll write them up on the whiteboard. So I'm going to delete the wireless code and just grab it now if you need it. And then we'll use that to guide the discussion and serve as the basis for most of the questions for the panelists. I've also got my own things that, frankly, I want to hear about. Moderator's privilege, I get to ask my own questions. But we'll principally use your questions. So as the panelists are introducing themselves, please think about what questions you'd like to ask, and we'll go ahead and get started. Mike, I'll let you. See if this works. Cool.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of a company called DroneDeploy, and we make drone software plus a bit of hardware.
My name is Adam Gettings, and I'm the CEO of Leeo. We make smart home products that are beautiful and simple and easy to integrate into your life.
I'm Nate Williams. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer of August. Our first product is the August Smart Lock. Folks have compared it to the Nest for door locks. 10-year smart home vet. This is my third IoT startup.
Peter Hébert. I'm a co-founder and managing partner of Lux Capital, based here in Menlo Park, and focused really on core technologies. Many of our entrepreneurs and our investments are in the hardware space. So.
Hi, I'm Manu Kumar. I'm an entrepreneur turned investor. My first investment ever was actually a hardware company, which was Lytro, which is building a new type of camera. A lot of the companies that I've invested in since, at one point almost a quarter of my portfolio was doing hardware of one kind or another. And my thesis around hardware is really around hardware that enables software. So we can talk more about that in the discussion.
So we'll start with your questions. And the more questions, the better, because otherwise you have to ask, listen to my questions.
And so where do you feel, with respect to IoT, the major revenue streams will be coming from, consumer or enterprise?
And I'll try to repeat them so people can hear. Major revenue streams from IoT, consumer or enterprise. All the way back.
Just on fundraising, since software companies really have been receiving the show in the last, let loud for the recovery, how are the hardware vendors and investors overcoming some of the obstacles in funding?
So my company makes an IoT device that goes in the home. It's like a Trojan horse. It's a pet treat cam. It allows you to remotely see your pet and treat it. But we have a huge social website behind that, a community that we're building. We don't know when we go to VC, do we focus on the hardware or the software?
I'll answer that with the classic lawyer answer, it depends.
Goes in the same direction, and more like I'm going to several events and they're mostly about software. And recently I was one that was actually said we are talking hardware at this event. Why did we came into a situation that we actually some sort apologize for doing hardware rather than software? So what went wrong in this space?
prototyping model, particularly with respect to speed and keeping costs down?
Cool.
That much harder, or just incurring more risk in building LLC companies that requires software, that requires hardware, that requires analytics. In other words, people companies don't work together. In a small company, you have so many headcount, it's very good to think like that. What's the
Right, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I'll kind of boil it down. How do you're focused on the team. How do you build a kind of a hybrid hardware-software team?
Valuations for the hardware company.
Early stage PR, getting your name out there before you're famous.
Related, it's early stage design firms that you can work
Couple minutes.
So sort of the interplay between prototyping and fundraising, how baked do you need to be?
You're not going to give your depends answer for
that? Try to only use one joke in a given. Although the how baked question usually comes up in like the marijuana business.
Yeah, I'm just curious about perspectives on applying basically the utility, the pay-per-use model that we see in software a lot, but towards hardware. So, you know, really just paying for what you use, even though it's hardware.
One more.
Logistics management in terms of supply chain.
We're going to get started. I liked his question about what went wrong with hardware, because it bakes in certain assumptions that something went wrong with hardware as opposed to software really taking off. I'll admit to all of you guys, if you don't mind, because I'm sure you guys all have thoughts. Some of you have done, either you've all done as investors or founders, multiple hardware companies. So have you walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and are you still there?
I'm happy to take that first as far as what went wrong. So we've been investing for, we've been investing for more than 15 years, really specifically first focused on hardware. And a lot of that was both at the component layer, so semiconductors, as well as, a couple layers up in terms of systems. And I think the reality is, there's multiple reasons why investors soured on some of the kind of core components in hardware spaces. One, a lot of this is before we'll talk about actually why now there's this new enthusiasm, which is a lot of things in rapid prototyping and crowdfunding and some other things that have driven a lot of consumer hardware. But on the enterprise stack, the reality is, this is where venture really got started. And starting in about 2000, people invested, in many cases, more than $100 million in a number of semiconductor companies and other systems companies selling into telecom equipment, and it was a complete bloodbath. And a lot of that was a function of the fact that it would take about $100 million or more to take a novel process or novel technology and bring it to a commercial foundry or place that you can get volume manufacturing. And then you were faced with the situation of either customers buying or not, and when they did, the reality is even companies that were successful, that built real business, that had margin, would go to strategic acquirers, the likes of large semiconductor and systems companies, and they weren't really willing to pay for innovation. And a lot of that was post-2000 hangover, where there was a period of great consolidation, and the multiples that people were willing to pay, the premium that people placed on innovation was extraordinarily low. So I see this today even in some of our companies that are by any measure on a P&L basis extraordinarily successful. And when we go into an M&A process, or we talk to bankers and we look at the multiples, it's pretty depressing. And that's really discouraging. And so people that, we consider ourselves fairly contrarian investors, but you can only break your pick so many times before you start to say, well, we need to start thinking about this differently. And so we continue to invest in hardware innovation. And a lot of that is not just what, a lot of things we'll talk about, which is kind of more consumer-facing hardware or new hardware. But we continue to make investments in early stage research and technology on the hardware side, recognizing that you really have to have some differentiated opinion and non-consensus view to make money, because the reality is you have zero wind at your back. It's really wind at your face. People, the acquirers out there are just not paying for technology. I speak to many of my compatriots in venture industry that invest in software and internet, and even if you fail, there's often a talent acquisition, or there's some premium paid where, Twitter, Facebook, Google, etc. pays someone hundreds of millions of dollars for something that might not even have a business. It does not exist in hardware. So I think it's really challenging when people saw more limited upside, where even in the best case scenario, probably likely mid hundreds of millions of dollars outcome after $100 million plus raised. And the downside is not just a talent acquisition, it is a complete zero. And so I think there are enough critters that certainly many semiconductor investors and other hardware entrepreneurs started feeling like they were coming from a leper colony, that they really started to move in and shift focus. So, by the way, do not mean to be bleak. I will get more enthusiastic about what we're excited about. Answering the specific question about why there was general lack of enthusiasm, or has been, in hardware.
I'll add a couple of points by kind of twisting your question around into what's changed to make hardware interesting again. And probably the world is flatter. You can actually get access to stuff from all over the world a lot more easily today than you could 15, 20 years ago. And that means just getting manufacturing done, whether you're doing it in China, Taiwan, or India, or anywhere else, or Mexico. There are lots of different places where manufacturing is a core competency, and they're now a lot more accessible than they used to be. So that's on one side. The other side of things which I feel has really changed is distribution mechanisms have really changed. Where earlier, if you were doing hardware, there was no other choice but to go through a channel. And that's just painful. You're kind of not controlling your own destiny. You're putting your product into the hands of somebody else and kind of expecting them to go and sell it for you. Whereas now, almost every hardware company that launches is essentially trying to go direct first. And they will only go into the channel much later on, once they've actually proven that there's a demand for their product.
Yeah, maybe just a couple data points. I think fundamentally, if we look at the economics, the marginal cost for software once you complete its GA is zero, right? So fundamentally, the difference of hardware, no matter how much scale you have, there's still an actual cost of producing that unit, whether it's coming from Flex or Foxconn, Pegatron, et cetera. So there are fundamental differences in the business. If you do it right in hardware, you really do it right. I don't think anybody's questioning the margin structure of Apple and what they're able to do, but the pathway to have a plain vanilla hardware company success is very difficult. You have to have a halo and a narrative. The second thing I would say is, having had a previous startup that's now part of Google, 5-10 years ago, I met Manu maybe 5-6 years ago. That environment before IoT was so hot, you could not get a quality engineer. You couldn't even get a 1X engineer, not a 10X engineer, 1X. People were really focused on social, they were focused on mobility. And what we're seeing now, and I think Adam, you probably see the same thing, is the best engineers, the best business people want to be part of something that's real. a physical device, something that you can see and you can love. And so when we look at, from an August perspective, the talent, it's folks from Facebook, it's folks from Google, it's folks from LinkedIn that want to work and connect. And so ultimately, as an investor, I'm an angel investor in Roost and ConnectHQ and a bunch of other companies, is I bet on the horses, I bet on the team. And the talent that's flowed into hardware in the last 5 years is really indicative of what I think will be this sort of renaissance. But ultimately, the meshing between hardware and software, I don't think of it as a hardware product or a software product, it's really a solution. And so that, it's like a jazz music. That jazz has to come together for a product to really be great. And so some great products I love, Sonos, that's a great product. Dropcam, GoPro. And so when we think of what we're trying to do at August, whether it's through Apple, our relationship with Apple, or our relationship with Google, is really have that moment of delight. And if we can do that well, we feel like on the economic side, we can make all the supply chain rest stuff work.
I think one thing you're getting at is this idea of hardware as being a delivery mechanism for software and services. So I think that's what's changed, and that's why people are more interested in this now. Because you can create with design and with other things. Physically, you can create a gravitation that people will walk through the products, purchase the products, integrate the products into their life, and then now you've got them looped into services via mobile and other add-ons and integrations. So that's the holy grail, I think, that we're going after.
I was going to add to that for us. I mean, we've got right now it's so much easier for anybody to build a hardware product. I mean, think about how many hardware products started as a Raspberry Pi with something added onto it. We started as a software company. I remember the day that our investor walked in, we showed him a piece of hardware that enabled us to do a lot of things with drones that no one else could do. And he said, "Oh, so you're a hardware company?" And our jaws just dropped and it's like, "Oh shit." I think it's a big change for us now, is that any piece of hardware functionally can just run a lot of software. And we see, it's interesting in the drone business, all the drone hardware companies call themselves software companies, even though they build autopilots or they build drones. They say, "Oh, we're a software company," because the software is more important to them. I think that's maybe a big difference now, is that any piece of hardware is driven probably as much by software, if not more by software, than the hardware itself.
People, Mike, not loud enough. People have kind of conflated hardware and IoT as almost being the same thing at the popular level. Is that fair? Is that right? How do you make the distinction, or is it now such a kind of a tagline buzzword that you have to throw in IoT, or else people will think, "Oh my God, you're just a hardware company"?
So I'll actually say that almost any device that gets built has to be connected. And so building a device that doesn't have a connection kind of doesn't make sense in today's world. So for me, it is almost interchangeable. That, and I actually don't like the phrase IoT. It kind of like feels really awkward to me. Internet of Things, like what the heck is that? So to me, it's connected devices, and that's really what we're talking about. And unless you're talking about hardware, which is kind of getting embedded into other systems, if you're actually designing like chips or cameras or something like that, then yes, you're not dealing with connectivity at that level because the connectivity is coming in at a higher level. So.
There's no doubt that the IoT, you like it or not like it. I choose not to like it myself, but as a secular trend, it's quite large. When we think of the process of physical devices getting digital representation, that's what we're talking about, whether it's a jet engine or a medical imaging piece of equipment or a door lock. So that's happening, right, because of cheaper, right, silicon that's got way more power, but also these ubiquitous networks. The interesting question I heard came from the audience is really about where the business model goes. So some of the best investments that I've seen come when you make a real hard assumption when you start the company. We're a mobile first company. We don't care about the PC interface. We go mobile. And now there are folks saying, I just assume that the connectivity is going to be there, and I can build a business on that. And so whether it's devices that you pay for on a usage basis, it opens up a brand new business model, or just new ways of connecting. So one of the biggest problems with connected devices and smart home over the last 10 years has been we've done a terrible job of making consumers feel like they have to learn a lot of stuff and they have to invest a lot of time in doing all these things. And so an analogy that I use is you could go and day trade every day. Probably 3% of the population does it. That investment of your time shouldn't be 10, 15, 20 minutes a day in smart home. We should be smart enough between our companies to actually understand who you are and start being more of a helper. And I think that's tough as an entrepreneur because you have to have the maturity to say, my product is going to have a different type of emotional connection than something that's media-based. How people feel about a game console or media product is a little different than something that's like an IoT hardware device. And so we're perfectly fine with that. We want to be something that's loved and respected, but we also want to play our role. And the one thing I would say is everybody talks about platform. That's another sort of buzzword that is just way overdone. You cannot have all these platforms. Just because you have a device and a piece of software, you're not a platform. So if you guys ever catch me on any speaking circuits and I say that August is a platform, please come up and correct me.
So, is IoT in danger of becoming the next clean tech in terms of rejection of the terminology?
I think I would say that's a loaded question, I guess, but
that's what I'm here for.
Yeah. I actually think it will be subsumed in something that's a little bit broader, more it's like connected devices or just people's perception of hardware, where unless you're talking about a component, you really mean something that just by its very nature will of course be connected. So I tend to agree, even going back to the prior question, that IoT to me seems like a convenient rebranding of certain things, where at the end of the day you're talking about a product, and it's probably better to understand what that product is rather than just this general thematic overlay, just like clean tech. How are you putting water purification in with biofuels and solar panels, and that didn't really make much sense.
I think if you think about the evolution of the telephone from Alexander Graham Bell to where it is today, and I think we still call it a phone. And so I think with things, we're still going to call them what they are, but we're just going to assume that they have more functionality and that they're smart and interconnected. So I think IoT is it's going to be forgotten, and it's going to be obvious. It's going to be things.
So at one point, companies used to run around saying that they're an internet company. You don't hear that anymore. At one point, you used to hear companies run around and say, we're a mobile company. You don't hear that anymore either. Okay. You used to have companies running around saying they're a big data company. That's equally bullshit. What isn't big data today? What isn't on the internet today? What isn't mobile today? What isn't connected today? So like all of these things, like the buzzwords kind of like run out of steam after a while because they just kind of becomes the lowest common denominator over time. So.
I'm sensing a tweet out of that last tweet.
Hopefully somebody will tweet it out and I'll retweet it.
You're saying we're all just companies? Yes.
Yes, ultimately you're building products and you're trying to build a business. That's what it ultimately comes down to.
You want to create lasting power. That's your company and you want to exist for a long time, and that's really it.
It was, and I can't quote the person because I don't remember who said it. Ultimately, everything comes down to you're solving a problem for somebody. They may not know that it's a problem yet, but it is a problem for them, and how you do it is secondary.
By the way, kind of random analogy, but I'm a big student of economic history and booms and busts, and there's a great quote talking about one of the many periods where the train industry, rails, went through consolidation, and in this case busted, and they said that people, thought, and that they failed to remember that they were in the transportation business rather than the train or rail industry. And so I think that is important, just to the earlier comment about kind of the phone industry, or people get so focused on the minutia of what they're defining their own individual product or industry is, rather than thinking about the value and the service that they're providing to their customers.
By the way, just since we talked about clean tech, it does make sense to look into the past couple years, think of investment trends. When we look at how capital was deployed in clean tech, it was actually pretty chunky. If we look 06 to 08, and if you ask most of the VCs who deployed capital around it, they say we bet too early on some teams and some products that actually didn't get there. And so one of the fears that I have in this sector of connected devices and hardware is it does become some sort of competition when you see Nest sold for 22x revenue. And that's a pretty big outcome, pretty major for a hardware company. And so if you look across the portfolios, hey, what's the next Nest? And we know from our fundraising, we recently raised $38 million from Bessemer and others, is there is this sort of feeling that folks want to get into the sector. And so my hope as an entrepreneur who's already been in the category for a decade is, I want to do this for the rest of my life, whether it's cool or not cool. I did it when it wasn't cool at all. Nobody was interested in home automation. And so I think the key from an investment perspective is we want to keep a fair amount of skepticism in the market. So there's going to be, at some point, there's just too many companies in the category and they can't last. And so at some point there will be a small correction in sort of consumer IoT. Enterprise, in my view, as an angel investor, is completely underfunded. Like enterprise security for IoT, if you look at the verticals, whether it's transportation or healthcare, that's really big. I think some of the folks, the younger entrepreneurs that are coming in, just see that, oh, you've got a company with a great product like Leeo, we'll do that, it'll be so visible. But it's very difficult and very tough on consumer IoT, especially when you talk about getting shelf space at a Best Buy, like we have, or at Apple, et cetera.
By the way, sorry to keep talking here, but one interesting thing, and I think like talking about the jargon that's used, IoT, connected devices, it's, to some extent, there was a question earlier, how should they position our company? Is it IoT or I forgot what the other choice was in this case, but this is one of the sad things about the investment community is that the function of having a lot of capital and there being a frenzy, people often feel, and of course most investors like Manu and myself would say this is never us, but you hear it all the time. People say, we need a play in X, Y, Z. So they see Nest happen, like, and then there's a partnership meeting and they're looking around saying, where's our play in IoT, or where's our play in the smart home? And people think of this almost like, you're putting chips down, markers down on individual numbers, where you need exposure to something. Whether that's because of pressure from their investors saying, why aren't you in this clean tech? Where's your biofuels play? Of course, they're no longer saying that, but you do see people, investors, it's really perverse, being responsive to this need to feel like they have exposure to a particular theme or trend, rather than focusing more bottoms up and saying, is this a great entrepreneur or team that I want to back? Is this a real business?
For the entrepreneurs, can you talk briefly about how your funding history has gone so that people understand kind of where you started and how you got where you are?
Sure, so we've raised about $37 million over the course of 2 years. Most of that came from private individuals and family offices, so we actually went outside of the Valley.
Why?
We did take $11.5 million from the Valley. Why? Because it was actually a lot easier.
Yeah. Before, after, both?
Well, I mean, sort of
easier. Which part of it was easier?
It's just opening up more opportunities. There's so much global capital in this. You were saying the world is a lot flatter, and everyone's interested in the Valley and investing here, and it makes a lot of sense to go outside the Valley. Plus, for strategic reasons, we brought on partners from Asia, partners from Europe that are major corporates that can open up markets for us.
So we're much earlier stage than these guys. We've raised 11 million, 2 rounds. Recently came out of our A round actually. It's been interesting for us because we actually a software company, but we're in a hardware space. And we're dependent on the hardware players succeeding. And we actually had to go into the hardware realm. In an early market where the hardware is not connected, we had to do the connection. We had to put the drones on the internet, and that's essentially what we had to do. And it's almost a rare situation now where you actually have to do that work. I was going to say earlier, there's something called, I don't know if anyone's seen the button, the BT.TM, I think it was launched last week, and it's a connected button. That's all it is. It's a button that's, when you press it, it connects to the Wi-Fi and it sends a message to somebody.
It's not called the Yo button.
Sorry?
It's not called the Yo button.
No, it's Yo button. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that any company now that's fundraising as a hardware company has a distinct disadvantage as being hardware. I think that's perhaps there's some more interest in there, something more tangible. But the way that you have to sell that company is not just as a hardware company. come and say, hey, I want this amazing block. It's more about the experience of the block. What is the, and I can guarantee you, as you guys have fundraised, there's a lot about the software and how the software makes that block something special and how that's difficult to replicate. That's something we see in the drone world. Every company, as I was saying, is billing themselves as a software company. The hardware is just that medium to carry that software. So that's a trend, I think, that, I don't know, that along the history of hardware, I think there's probably a newer trend, such as the emphasis of software within the hardware as what is actually being, what actually makes the product.
We've raised close to $50 million in 3 rounds. We just closed a $30 million Series B. Bessemer was the lead, Dolby, CAA, Rogue, Cowboy, and Comcast, a few others came in. Won't go into too much detail because that's a Jason and Eve question, other than to say, from our standpoint, the round was oversubscribed, but I agree with you. It's really around value add. I mean, that's a term that gets used a lot, but my experience is I have seen investors in my previous startups that have been awesome and made critical decisions, had product input, had a business relationship that helped. So when we were looking across how we were going to do the last round, it was what investors did we feel would allow us the ability to choreograph the company we want to build. We want to build a very meaningful, a very long-term company that is a lot different than what other folks are seeing. So we've talked about this idea of the last 5 feet. We're not really focused on what happens inside the house. We're really focused on people, products, and services entering that last 5 feet of the home. And that's an area we feel like we can absolutely win. We've got high ground, and our choice of investors was really, do they believe in the vision? And can they help us with things to operationalize that? So VCs have great networks. They've helped out. Our Bessemer would be an example, helping out with hiring, getting us in front of some really great people. The other part is startups are lonely by nature. There's this idea that it's so social when you're just hanging out and wearing your hoodies and going to drink coffee. I mean, it's a grind. It's 7 days a week. It's 15 hours a day. And sometimes the perspective of a VC who's seen the cycles and has the pattern recognition, when you're putting your head against the wall, I just negotiated a big contract that will be announced next week, and it took one of our VCs to say, you're in the deal, you're totally wound up emotionally, you're gonna get where you need to go, just take a step back and this is gonna be really big for you. I think that's the area. And so again, there's smart money, they always talk about that, there's dumb money. I think the best investors, whether it's an angel or sort of mid-stage, they differentiate themselves and their brand by rolling up their sleeves. And it's not about volume, it's about efficacy. It's about when you need that favor. If you call Ron Conway, you're gonna get something, you get it right away. If you're dealing with, Eileen from Cowboy, who's on our investor list, she's been super great. Made a huge introduction that helped me last week.
From the investor perspective, especially because a lot of people in the audience, I think, are early stage entrepreneurs, what is it, given the headwinds facing hardware companies, what is it that can distinguish a young company such that it's interesting to you guys? What is it that you look for when you're looking at an early stage company?
So, and I've used this joke on multiple occasions. You may have heard me use it before. You cannot spell hardware without H-A-R-D, hard. And hardware, by definition, requires multiple areas of competency, and it's at least 3x harder than doing a software company, right? So you have, in a hardware company, you need to do the hardware, you need to do the manufacturing, you need to do the logistics and distribution, and you need to do the software. Right? So there's a lot more stuff involved when you're actually trying to do hardware. And so it's a much riskier bet for an investor to actually make that on the team, that this is a team that's going to be able to figure out not just the one thing that a software company needs to figure out, but like these 4 or 5 different areas need to get covered by this team. Right? Or they need to have the ability to build a team to do that. So the number one thing that I'm looking for when I'm looking at, I describe myself as a frighteningly early stage investor, right? So in most cases, I end up investing in a company when it's like 1 person or 2 people in the company. There's like barely a prototype, and that's the stage at which I end up getting involved with the company. So at that stage, the most important thing I'm looking for is who are the people, what have they done, what are they capable of doing, and is it an interesting enough idea, right? So those are the basic things that I look for, and also I also manage like how many hardware companies am I willing to take on at one time? Like it's just stressful to be involved it's more stressful to be involved in a hardware company than it is to be involved in a software company. Okay. And so I also kind of manage like how many of those companies can I take on at any one time.
So in our portfolio, we have probably close to 65 active investments. Out of those 65, I'd say, this is just off the cuff, probably more than 20 of those would be hardware. If I think about the most successful companies in our portfolio, forgetting about what some of the things that have gone off the rails, the most successful ones, I would say there was a quality that the teams, the idea, the product, there was something that was virtually indistinguishable from magic. There was a feeling that all of us got in the room when we first heard the story and the entrepreneur's vision or whatever they showed us, that we felt this tingly feeling. And so a lot of that is difficult to quantify. It's not to say, well, where was the team slide versus the market size and the TAM and the deck. It is a very subtle qualitative element in an entrepreneur or a presentation or a vision that resonates. But let me just give you a handful here, 4 or 5 companies that to me stand out, both when they first presented to us and even since then what they've done. So one company is called Matterport in 3D scanning. This is really, to some extent, a software business in drag, in the sense that to enable their software to get out to the market, they had to build a physical product, which is an extremely complex operation. They've now done that. They have this piece of hardware that is doing extraordinarily well, selling into residential real estate market for scanning physical spaces, capturing them, converting them into digital files. Another company, Shapeways, which is a leader in terms of 3D printing marketplace. They're the largest producer of 3D printed goods. In fact, many of our companies use them for initial prototyping for their products. It's really a huge long tail business. I remember when we were analyzing it first, we were saying, what's going to be the big runner? What's the high volume product? The reality is, I think this is accurate, but I'll probably be quoted even if this isn't accurate. They have more individual products than Amazon has SKUs right now. So it's this extraordinary long tail business, huge number of products, but all that complexity is free for them because of their process. Another one that's really interesting, exciting, Planet Labs. This is a group from NASA. They're building these cube satellites, nano satellites. They have now, it's a 4 or 5 year old company based in San Francisco. Their clean room is basically people walking around in Birkenstocks, but they're producing satellites that right now it's the world's largest constellation of satellites. They have 70 in space, and by the end of this year they'll have more than 100 capturing every spot on the planet once a day. There was something that was just special and magical. And then finally, and I'm sure I missed one, I did miss another company, but I'll pass over that, a really interesting company that today is in stealth, but it's in the area of surgical robotics. And it's an amazing visionary entrepreneur who's had extraordinary success, so that makes it easy where you'd say, oh, of course, they've done this before, they're going to do it again. But you see what they've created, and you see their demo in this quiet, unmarked facility in Redwood Shores, and you come away saying, wow, that is going to change the world. And so it's difficult, especially when you're starting off as an entrepreneur, to try and convey that effectively. In many cases, you don't have a product to be able to do that, but you have to find some way as an entrepreneur to capture their imagination, capture their excitement, because more often than not, that's how decision making is made. It's not just hyper-rational, process-oriented, well, here's the market size, here's what they can capture. At the earliest stage, it's truly persuading and convincing someone that you were going to do something amazing.
It's hard to follow that answer with a question, because I'm going to bring it down a little bit. But for the execs, do you mind talking about your go-to-market strategy? Because you guys are approaching very different markets. And how did you come up? What was your go-to-market strategy, and how did you decide that was the way to go?
Well, So what we decided to do is to not do crowdfunding. We decided to not do pre-order. We decided to just remain in stealth until we had a product that we could ship. And so we did that and started launching on our website, and then started rolling out e-commerce, and then we're doing brick and mortar later this year. But I think that was a conscious decision to sort of avoid the crowdfunding approach, to spend more time getting the product right, shipping it on time, that sort of thing, getting our operational ducks in a row.
Yeah, from my perspective, owning go-to-market and the revenue and partnership teams, we wanted to get the product in locations as a hero product that's going to give us the right type of visibility and distribution. So we are at Apple, at Amazon, and at Best Buy. We're the only company, I believe, in the history of Apple, third party, that has a third-party display in Apple stores. And so for us, we have to come from a position of we're taking a category that's not a new category, but we're reimagining that. And part of that is with these physical products, especially in new categories, there's a narrative that you have to choreograph. So everything from the information you get online to how you walk in the store, even things like inline purchase displays, point of purchase displays. The hardest part of having a product that sits at retail is the last 3 feet. How do I get that product off the shelf and put it into the cart? And so everything we need to do has to focus on getting that product, into the shelf. The other thing I would say from a distribution is you have to really understand your segmentation, and you have to understand the best way to message that to consumers. So there's some folks who just want awesome gadgets and they have high disposable income. There's other folks who are really task oriented. So if you're a Home Depot buyer, you're probably going there on a specific project on a specific weekend. And so they don't have the time to invest waiting 10, 20 minutes to get a demo. They're either gonna buy the product or not. And so our goal is to partner with the leading channels, starting with retail, and we'll roll out some others in the next couple weeks. And over time, allow our consumers to get this great experience. The other thing I would say is important for us is make sure that we're not propagating another set of platform standards that are just going to confuse the hell out of people. So we are an Apple HomeKit partner, where we're a Works with Nest partner, and a few others. We actually believe in the fact that there will be some major platforms that will be the superhighways, and our job is not to create another platform war.
You may not be able to answer this question because it may be sensitive, but how has that been working with Nest and Apple, and are they okay knowing that you're trying to play the Switzerland role?
I love that show Silicon Valley. That Pied Piper company is really great.
Mike, I had to ask at least.
So it's on our go-to-market. So I think a big job, as a startup, we've got limited resources, so you've got to try and simplify as much as possible. And that's what we've done with our hardware. We've taken the simplest possible approach. We've done that with our go-to-market as well. So our first big market is agriculture, and we've chosen that for a whole number of reasons. One of the big ones just being risk. With these flying robots, they can do really amazing things, but it's much easier to start them off in rural America than over the city. But how do we start selling to farmers? We had no idea. So all we have to do is find the right partners to work with. The way the farmers buy things is through their local distributor, the guy that sells them tractors and fertilizers. We had no network into those kind of things. So a big part of it was finding the right partners to work with that did have those things, that did have relationships with their customers, that could convince them to buy this crazy flying machine that was going to change the way they could get information about their farm. So that really has made our route to market faster, and also given us a lot of guidance, because we could actually work with people that understood the industry and could deliver us very important product information very quickly that we could react to and build a stronger business with. That's a starting point, and that there are some disadvantages to having a channel model like that. So what you want to do is just stand on the shoulders of giants, basically use it as a leverage point to put yourself in a better position to take on the future. We just started a direct sales model as well.
This is going to sound sarcastic, but it's not. Did you have to hire a farmer in order to understand at some level even how to get into the channel partners? Or should you have hired a farmer?
We're getting more, not into farmers specifically, but into the ag world. We have to get that information into our team. Luckily, there were guys in the drone industry that were selling drones to farmers, and they were begging for a product like ours. The drones were being sold were really difficult to use. The software was awful. In fact, our leading channel partner used to sell drones, and it used to come with 3 pieces of software, not just one, to get anything done. It used to take 50 steps, more than 50 steps, not 50 clicks. So there was like 100 clicks to get anything done. And so we could just solve that pain point, and that enabled us to get into the market a lot faster.
Manu, Adam mentioned crowdfunding. They rejected that. From an investor's perspective, what's your take on where crowdfunding fits into this?
So I think crowdfunding is probably being overused today. And I think it's probably because it's almost kind of jumped the shark. And a lot of the people who are participating in crowdfunding, they're not doing it as if they are backing a product. They're doing it as if they're buying a product. They're acting like consumers. And so the risk that then creates for companies is that you have people who are essentially expecting you to deliver on time based on what you've said. And to date, I have yet to find a hardware company that's actually been able to deliver on time. Okay. And so, I mean, hardware is hard. There are things that are outside of your control. You don't know what's going to happen in the supply chain. The guy who's supposed to ship you a particular part is going to be like, oh, I had a flood and I can't get you this part. And there's just all kinds of different things that can go wrong. We have had one company in which the manufacturer put the wrong resistor in the wrong location, and it screwed up 4,000 parts, right? Like 4,000 units as a result of that, right? And so there are lots of little things that can go wrong, and the consumers don't, and note that I'm using the word consumers, not backers, don't understand that these are startups. They're actually building these products in some cases where the technology hasn't even existed before. And so I think crowdfunding comes with a lot of risks. And so my perspective on crowdfunding these days is that it's good to use to kind of show demand, but it's not a good idea to actually use it as a way of funding the company. Yeah.
You were talking about the delays. As part of your responsibilities on the board, obviously the CEO is kind of reporting to you, at least indirectly. How much delay do you build into this is just part of being a hardware business? And how do you decide that, no, the team's actually kind of failing at some level with what they're doing?
My rule of thumb is whatever I'm told, I 2x that. And that's almost for everything, not only for a hardware company. But yeah, it's tough to tell because there's just so many externalities in a hardware company that it's very hard to tell where the problem is actually coming from. And so it's and sometimes it's just out of control. So I don't have a good answer to that other than that there's just a lot of uncertainty and you just have to manage through it.
That's where experience really matters. So if you're thinking of critical path and you have a hardware product and you're trying to get to shipping units and you've got prototypes, the folks with the experience know that they need to get on a plane. They need to get over at the factory. They need to do a factory setup. You need to get the board up. You have to Gerber the board. You have a firmware schedule that has to be loaded. There's a cloud schedule. And so part of the success or failure of an early stage startup, if they're going to go attempt a hardware, despite folks that can help in the ecosystem, whether it's a Lab9 Flex or PCH, that's a trusted partner, but it doesn't replace the person on the team that actually has that experience, because let me tell you, stuff can get extremely hairy, and I think folks, if you're running a Kickstarter campaign, you're like, wow, I sold 50,000. If you talk to Flex, Foxconn, Pegatron, WNC, 50,000 is a rounding error. You need to be talking in millions of units. Talk about what Apple ships, or even Cisco or Motorola set-top box. We're talking millions of units a year. And so you'll get laughed out of the building and say, I want to do a run of 10,000. That's nothing. And so experience matters. The other part is really just around decision making. So the difference between, per se, an entrepreneur or an executive at a company is just comfort with ambiguity and risk. You can take some risk in software, you can build it up by just throwing in more sprints, you can hire folks. There are certain things you can't do in hardware to make a schedule accelerate. So there's a joke some of my VC friends use, 9 men can't make a baby in 1 month. That's the same way with hardware. You can have all these great goals. If you're not working on your hardware that's going to be shipping this fall and for the holiday season, you're completely out of the game. And so making the right hires, holding people accountable to high quality. So whether, folks should know when they need to get an SSL cert, folks should know if somebody's a cheaper ODM or contract manufacturer, maybe there's a reason why they're cheap. They never deliver on time, or maybe they don't have that relationship with Broadcom. And that would be the last thing. We've internally brought on folks from supply chain sourcing that have some real experience. And so it's important that they see you from another life. So I was an executive at Motorola between my last startup, and I had the ability of creating these relationships. And so when I go and speak to somebody over there, they not only know me from the context of an entrepreneur, but they remember the volume that we were generating there. I think that's super important.
So I'm going to give just a few anecdotes of the type of things that can go wrong, right? And these are all like real life examples. One example that was told me by somebody who runs manufacturing at a company was they were literally had containers full of their product that was getting manufactured in China and literally being shipped across to the US. Well, they would pack the container, make sure everything is good. The stuff would show up stateside, and it just would look like crap. And it would look like crap because moisture was getting inside the container while it was on the ship. And the moisture was actually ruining the packaging. Okay? And so all the stuff that they would actually get would be ruined because of the moisture. And how much time it takes for it to actually show up, the cost of the product is just it just ends up creating more delays. Another example, and this is probably the silliest one, is when they were running the stuff that manufactured through test, the test wouldn't come right. They couldn't get the test to run. Well, it turns out that they were using a bad network cable in the manufacturing facility. Right? It was as simple as that. It was literally like a 50-cent cable that was bad, and that caused almost a month or 2 months worth of delay for the company. Right? And CMs and ODMs, they will randomly change stuff without even telling you about it, right? They will be like, oh, we can get this part cheaper. Here it costs 50 cents, and we're going to put in a 10-cent part, and it's going to work just the same. Well, they don't know what differences it's actually going to make, and you may not find out until the product is actually reached into the hands of consumers that your CM or ODM actually made this change without telling you about it. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff that can happen when you're building a hardware product, and these are things that it's just very hard to account for up front.
So there's not much to add. I think this has been a great conversation. Totally agree. Huge concatenated risks that exist within hardware companies. We've also had companies that have been affected by floods in Thailand that have impacted contract manufacturers. And in one case, we went lying down on a very high volume product for one of our companies because of what is the rough equivalent in an integrated package of basically on a car, like the windshield wiper. Completely irrelevant, didn't matter at all, but they were, they had a single source. There was a disruption in supply, and we went lying down, and that really impacted the business. So the reality is, from a lot of our backgrounds in being investors in very complex hardware semiconductor businesses, we're always trying to understand exposure and risks that exist, especially on the sourcing side, where you can get everything right, everything. And just one little small externality goes against you, and the business could collapse, or you could suffer huge cash strain that you didn't anticipate.
So the thing I say to entrepreneurs who are building a physical product most often, the most common thing I say to them is have a backup, and then have a backup to the backup. That's the only way to operate when you're building a physical product.
In a prior life, I used to sell electric meters and worked for a couple of startups. And we had a guy sit in Malaysia who he got an apartment 3 blocks from the CM just because they were so difficult. Is that, you know, I usually tell that story to my clients now. Is that still kind of the way you have to think about it, that you really, even though it could be a great trusted partner, even if it's Flex or the best, you should still have one of your people there?
We got the chairman to invest from a major manufacturer, and so we have his personal cell phone number.
I think there are companies that do that, successful companies that do that, and companies that think they're successful that just don't know that they will have to do that. So I think it's inevitability. You have to run a sophisticated manufacturing operation. You have to be on site. That means lots of international travel. There's only so much that you can outsource, and as you scale, it's just not a realistic strategy.
You have to have boots on the ground. It could be manufacturing, it has to do the same even when sales go to market. Ultimately, if it's your company, you're going to be able to evangelize the vision the right way. And so even in my team, you know, we've really brought a lot of that in-house and hiring aggressively to have folks inside, as opposed to, you know, traditionally a startup would hire consultancies that, you know, rep Fitbit and others. I think at the end of the day, they want to see you, the people that they're making that you know, emotional connection with, and I want to live up to the commitments we make. The one point we did miss is you can have everything go well on supply chain, you can get the products here, you can have your 3PL get them to a DC or a distribution center for a retailer, and then you still have the channel risk of that's your inventory, and if something goes wrong in terms of what they do or you don't get the sell-through, a lot of hardware companies die because they take on too much inventory risk and they have so much of their balance sheet in inventory, they can't bleed that inventory. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking through is just modeling volume sensitivities of how this will sell based on how much marketing, how much paid search, SEO, etc. Because if you sit on a bunch of inventory, and especially inventory that's, you know, several $100s a pop, that's a great way to really train wreck a company.
By the way, fantastic point. The reality is very few entrepreneurs appreciate that success can often create failure when you don't fully understand your working capital requirements, how you finance inventory. You need a greater level of sophistication than when you just start off and you have a successful Kickstarter or Indiegogo program or campaign. So I actually think, you know, as soon as you really start getting product in market, you need to adopt a much more rigorous approach to how you finance the business, making sure that you have a cash buffer to actually plan for success, and not just thinking that, oh, we're only going to need cash if we're not selling product.
And it can be something as simple as what kind of terms you get from your CM. Do they require you to pay upfront, or are they going to give you net 60? Or they're going to give you 90. Just like something like that, as simple as that, can change how the finances are going to work out.
And VCs hate this, but you can sometimes broker equity for terms, which is if you think it's going to be a while before you're going to take venture money, it may be worth thinking about those sorts of alternative arrangements.
I was going to say, for the guys looking to do a hardware startup, we've been talking a lot about China and how you've really got to be there, and I've heard lots of stories about people getting apartments and co-founders rotating so they could be there full time. But as a startup, the easiest thing to do is just to pay the 3x more and do it here. In Santa Clara, there's so many guys, and interestingly, there's actually probably a lot more expertise in China to do a lot of things like materials and things like that you might not have here. But just to be able to have boots on the ground, to be able to go over there and to be able to easily communicate and understand exactly what's going on, see it every day, that makes a huge difference. And as in the early days, it speeds you up so much. So it's worth spending the extra money for that, so that it's going to be a huge speed increase.
We've talked a little bit about team. How do you build kind of a hybrid hardware-software team, and how do you bridge the theoretical gap between the hardware and software engineers and really combine it into a team?
I'm actually going to twist your question a little bit into one of the forms of failure that I've seen is where the hardware team and the software team are totally siloed from each other. And there's nobody who's kind of holding both the hardware and the software in one head. That's a point of failure mostly because the software doesn't work as well on the hardware, or the hardware doesn't do something that the software needs.
Is that usually the CEO, or is that somebody else?
hopefully it's somebody who is really kind of like, I prefer to call that person kind of like the chief product officer, right? Like the product is not just the hardware product, it's both the hardware as well as the software and the overall experience. And so I really want in the companies that I'm investing in, I want somebody who's really looking out for the entire product, and they have responsibility for the entire product, and there's no finger pointing going on that, oh, the hardware guys didn't do this or the software guys didn't do that.
Ideally, they're sitting right next to each other, so they can reach over and smack each other when they need to.
We'll go into sort of rapid fire mode, so any of you can take the questions. Early stage PR. How important, and this may relate to the crowdfunding, but how do you manage that?
I think it's of critical importance, right? When you look at the cost of actually generating demand, PR is one of the cheaper forms of getting that demand out there. We've got some unfair advantages because Yves Behar is so well known as, you know, a celebrity designer, Jawbone, and one laptop per child. That's really helped. But part of the maturity of an executive is knowing when to ride horses and move on. So in my case, I really have to focus on widening the funnel at August. And so that idea of the Dwell magazine or some of these really esoteric valley things are good initially when you start, but over time it's about getting more in lifestyle. And so the ability, whether it's a USA Today or being on the Today Show or CBS This Morning, and so the right PR partner, we work with Brew Communications, they're great. The right partner can really help. But one of the things I would caution is a lot of the stories have seemed recently very plain vanilla. We're going to reinvent this, we're inspiring. I think you have to have a narrative that doesn't put you and your personality first. It has to be about how the consumer is going to win. There's just a lot of chest pounding right now about how smart all these X people are going to do this and make it so much better. In some ways, we have to respect these industries that we're going into. There's been folks who built huge companies. So in our case, there's Assa Abloy and Schleg and others. These are multi-billion-dollar, multinational companies that have done a lot of things well to be in business for so long. We want to have a healthy respect for those folks, and we also want to respect the customer that it is a new category. And when you're trying to change something that's of habit, it takes time. People are used to going home and pulling out their keys when they walk home. We're changing that habit, so it's almost like similar to with a car. Would you take a physical key and open your car door anymore? Not in 2015, that just seems so crazy. And so we're trying to have this new behavior, which is like if you're coming back for a run or with your family, you just walk right into the front door. It auto unlocks because of a geofence. And so PR is really important. Not all PR is good PR, and not all PR is worth it. So I actually see some of the startups that I've invested in spend too much time focusing on PR, and I would encourage them to spend more time on building a better product.
I also say to companies that use your PR bullets wisely. You only have a few of them, right? And so don't try and get PR when yes, it might get you a lot of attention, but if you don't have anything to sell, then you're kind of missing the point of actually getting the PR that early. So like have a clear goal for what you want from the PR. If you want to use it for recruiting, great. If you want to use it for fundraising, great. If you want to use it for actually selling product, great, right? But don't do PR just for ego. So.
Also, make sure that you want all the journalists to be really excited when they get your email or phone call. So you want to hold back, hold back a bit and store up something really exciting and just consistently wow them because they are the first line customer for PR.
At most, you have like one shot per quarter at PR, right? Because nobody's going to write about you again and again and again. So you have to do something new and interesting before they're going to write about you.
For the VCs, the question was around the interplay between prototyping and fundraising. Peter, you talked about seeing the magic. Do you need a prototype? Is it better to have a prototype, or is it better to sell pure magic in the concept?
So this is where I will invoke the depends answer, and it really depends on the individual, their track record, and their ability to excite. I think if there's someone whose background is much more of an operator and a doer rather than a charismatic salesperson, I think then there's probably a greater hurdle to climb where there has to be something to actually show, because if you're unable to convey that excitement and enthusiasm, then it needs to be the product that's doing it. There are people every day that walk into boardrooms around here and persuade people to part with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars without anything to show for it. And in many cases, those companies can be extraordinarily successful. So it's not just that this is carnival huckster. But I really think the most important thing, and this is actually what I look for in entrepreneurs, is really understanding of an individual's limitations. Do they know what they're particularly good at? Do they know where their skill set ends and where they need to find other complementary folks? And in this case, I think it's just being introspective and saying, I'm not particularly good at selling the vision, so then guess what? You're going to have to work harder and actually produce a product that's going to at least get people's imagination and mind turning.
Mike, the FAA is taking a lot of interest in drones, and a lot of IoT companies are, whether they're health oriented, there's a regulatory strategy that has to come about. How should early stage companies be thinking about the regulatory piece?
Hard question. It depends. I think it's two things. One is how do you try and avoid it for as long as possible. We don't fly drones. We don't make drones. Our customers do those things. We want to try and enable them, and so we're not at risk, but they are. And how do we enable them? I think the second thing is that look, this is I think one thing everyone always says is that innovation will always lead regulation. So you just got to go do it, and make sure that you position yourself well for regulation. I mean, that's one of the things we did. We hired the best person we could that could help us get a handle on regulation, help us join the right conversations and be able to speak to the FAA, be able to speak to the people in Washington. But at the end of the day, you just got to do these things. You can't wait for any regulation. It's going to be slow. It's going to require you to lead us and say, we can do these things. One of the things that we can do now, which is particularly strengthen our companies, so an example of how you've actually got to think about what you want to push is we can do beyond line of sight flying of drones. Our drones are connected to the extent they're unique in that. And I can launch a drone from this room across the world, which is way beyond whatever the FAA is even thinking about. They didn't even know that's possible. We don't talk about that to them either. But we don't talk about that to them because we're not posing that's something that we want to do, because we know that we've got other battles that we have to win first. So you've got to pick your battles and be smart about how you navigate the regulatory world.
Yeah, somewhat related is the privacy question. I mean, you guys have perhaps some of the most private data. Who's coming in and out of your house when? How should companies think about that, and how do you guys think about privacy?
There's certainly been a lot of dialogue about it, including right at CES with FTC comments, etc. The first is you have to respect the consumer, the user. And you have to know that certain data is private to them, and you have to give them the empowerment to make a decision of what they want to do with their data. People say with great data comes great responsibility. Part of it is really being transparent about the uses of data and where consumers feel that they can get a better experience, whether that's personalization or whether that's, I'd say better performance, they're willing to do it. But that discussion, there was a MIT New Deal on data. There's been a lot of discussions about both regulation and how to use the data. I think it comes down to just a healthy, open discussion about the type of data that's generated and how that data can actually make the product better. Folks get more concerned because it's a little different than on Facebook posting stuff and then you get retargeted for like an Audi or a Ford. There's that joke with Nest that your house could have a fire and you get retargeted with like a Google ad for a fire extinguisher. It's in jest, but there's some healthy skepticism. So what we try to do is engage the stakeholders on the security and privacy debate, and then in terms of our user, end user licensings and things like that, it's very clear of what they're willing to share and what they're not willing to share.
I think people are pretty smart, and if you're honest and transparent about what you're doing with the data, how it's part of the product, how it works. Just explain how it works, and people make their own decisions around that. And if they want to integrate these products in their lives, and the trend is that they are wanting that, then we're here to help. So I think the user has the power to decide.
Let me open up to questions in case I didn't get one of your questions or other things that.
How do you think about piracy? Is it avoidable or is it a byproduct of success?
So I'm guessing you're talking about copycat products.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And by piracy, like in China, it's fairly common that your products are literally getting like they're maybe manufacturing 180 go to you and 20 go to somebody else. So the best way of dealing it is the one that you have to accept that it's going to happen, and the way that you have to prevent or safeguard yourself is by holding some of the keys that kind of prevent kind of your secret sauce keys. Right? So in some cases, I've had companies where they will manufacture their products in China, but they will only load the firmware stateside. Okay. In other cases, the firmware is actually kept in a secure room that only specific people have access to. And so that firmware and kind of the software piece of it is what really ends up becoming the crown jewels of your product. And that's kind of what you have to protect and safeguard.
Well, one nice thing about interconnected products is that you can have a base level of software on the product so that when the user gets it, they can set it up, and then it connects to the internet and downloads the secret sauce. So that's an easy way to keep it separate.
Other question?
If you are a first-time hardware startup, and in this case, you need prototype to find funding. But in order to find funding, you need in order to have the prototype, you need funding, basically. Where do you start?
So that's the oft-mentioned chicken the egg conundrum that entrepreneurs face in hardware. And others, obviously in the panels, sometimes disagree for things like that without access to equity capital. For instance, let's just assume that you go out and you're unsuccessful persuading someone that the PowerPoint is something that you can physically manifest and create a real business. Crowdfunding, a variety of other things where perhaps you're trying to bring revenues forward by showing visually depicting a product that you will then build are probably the best routes. And again, we happen to be in a relatively talent and financially wealthy and rich environment where money is relatively abundant. So that's beneficial, of course, but that being said, doesn't mean that it always, an entrepreneur and investors always match up. And so I still think that for a variety of reasons, I think that crowdfunding does make sense if you're unable to raise equity capital.
I'd add that prototypes come in different levels of fidelity. And I'll give you an example of one of my portfolio companies, which is Osmo. So they have a product which it's an accessory for an iPad where you put this mirror on the iPad and now you use computer vision to let you interact on the surface of the table. Okay. The prototype for that was literally like a 50-cent mirror, a bunch of acrylic and super glue, right? And everything else was software. Okay. So there's different levels of prototypes that you can start with, and yes, of course, like over time for them to get to a final product, they have to do multiple revisions and kind of refine that product. But for showing the concept, right? So the first prototype that I look for is like, at least show me that you've tried, okay, and that you can actually prove that, and you can communicate the concept using the prototype that you've built.
And by the way, in addition to venture funds or venture capitalists, something that was briefly mentioned earlier on the panel, but there are a variety of various hardware accelerators that now exist that are seeking to solve exactly the problem that you just mentioned, where it might be too early for larger venture funds, but for someone that has expertise in building hardware companies, they're willing to help you build that prototype, position the company such that they can then later go to investors where it's obvious, oh, okay, you've built it, you've done something, you've been guided in a particular, on a particular path, and this is a lot more intuitive for an investor to say, sure, now I'll invest. And most of them happen to be in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is also a great thing.
I would just say from a personal quality standpoint, I mean, one of the things that defines the best entrepreneurs is grit. And part of grit is looking at these constraints and actually being able to, persevere through. So whether it's having a friend who's connected in hardware that can give you some parts, folks talk a lot about Steve Jobs calling up, Hewlett Packard and others and getting supplies. But I really look for that in folks that I work with or others, because it's a series of challenges each day. And if you don't have the ingenuity or the resilience to get a MVP prototype in front of Manu, that may lead to a thinking that, well, how are you going to get that customer? Because Best Buy might not want to take a meeting with you. Or how do you get that engineer who's sitting on this ginormous RSU package from Google? So if I break down my day into things that I do, it's all about, showing determination, but influencing, trying to get somebody to do something, whether it's coming in early, accepting a deal term. So key entrepreneur DNA is all about believing in the impossible and also that influence. So if you're really great, you would hopefully pull something together that would allow Peter, Manu, or whoever you're talking to show the promise. And I've invested in things that didn't have a working prototype, but they say, here's how I can take this and turn it to that.
I think one more thing is that you want to have a series of conversations, and as soon as you have the idea and you're committed to it and you're starting to build it, you should have those conversations with angels and VCs and meet several times to show them the evolution of the prototype. So you can show them the super glue and the acrylic parts, and you can show them when it starts to take more form and some of the renderings of what it's going to look like. You should be having that relationship develop over time.
By the way, that's so funny you said that. Some of the best advice I ever got is you never want to show a VC the picture. You want to show them the movie. The motion picture is the space between those data points is, I talk to Peter and I say, I'm going to do this in the next month. Come back a month later, the prototype's done. We got this killer engineer on the team, etc. And so again, I like that with the caveat that there is a thing that I see recently with like over communicating. It's like, point updates during the week, probably not so much. It's like a month is a good period of time to show you've made some progress.
I was going to add on the last thing. I don't think it's really money that you would be really needing for time. And I think for anybody that's actually building a business, if you want to build a new hardware products, you might not feel like you know how to do that. But I think it's really important to be able to just learn that, hack together the first one. Even though it's going to be really bad, that's okay. That's all you need to actually take it to the next level. And you might well need it to be able to go to that accelerator. We went through an accelerator. I don't know if you guys did, but I think that's it is a really important thing to do. Is any startup, it really gives you, it really does accelerate you. If you go to the right accelerator, you can get so much advice and really push you forward. You need to learn a lot to be able to actually do the first successful round of financing, be able to get introduced to people that can show you the path they took and the things they had to do to get to the position that you want to get to. Those two things: learn how to do it. It's going to be important for your business, and do go to an accelerator.
Other questions?
Minimal team that you're looking for.
Minimal team that you're looking for in a company.
I've invested in hardware companies when there was one person. So that's the minimal team.
Invest in half of a person.
Just a dog.
Actually, in this case, it was a case of where the founder actually walked in and he showed me what he built. He showed me a prototype, right? And I'd already looked him up on LinkedIn and stuff, and so I kind of knew what his background was. And I asked him, okay, who built the hardware? And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, who built the hardware? Because I looked at your background, you're a software guy. And he's like, well, I just went and figured it out. Okay, and that's kind of what tipped me over. So.
Yeah, a lot of there is no minimum, besides the human being or squirrel or small varmint, but it's some sort of characteristic that I think, especially if it's just in a single individual, that you say this person's going to do amazing things. Another analogy, one of the earlier star employees for one of our companies, Shapeways, based in New York, is this woman, Kegan Schoenberg. And so she was walking around what they call this Factory of the Future, which is in Long Island City, printing all these 3D printed objects. And it always helps when you have a personal story that that kind of exhibits this drive and passion, and it can't be too canned, of course. But in this case, she was walking around in like these 4-inch heels, and her feet were killing walking around the factory managing this. And so she said, why can't we use 3D printing to create kind of customized orthotics rather than the, Dr. Scholl's that you see in Walgreens that are, one size fits all for everyone. And so that's really what led her to quit Shapeways and start this company, Souls. And at that point in time, she came in and we knew that she was a dynamo. She was, extremely ambitious and impressive and just hard-charging tinkerer. And all of us said, orthotics, insoles, really? This is going to be the business? And so we made a small, for our fund, a small several $100,000 investment early on, and just a couple weeks later she started, in this case I think it was every week, but it was soon enough that was fine, updates. And we said, she absolutely just blew us away with what she was accomplishing. And so probably about 6 weeks later, we just preempted her even going to the market and telling other entrepreneurs what she was doing, and we just said, here are the terms for a Series A financing. So in that case, she hadn't, when we first met her, she had done nothing other than just knowing that she was going to do something. And then we started to watch her, and we could have perhaps not have been investors at that point in time, and just observed all the momentum that she was driving. But we had the benefit of having somewhat of an inside view and said, this is going places.
Last question.
Yeah, fundraising is hard. In mega rounds, it's mega hard, right? Yet as a category, IoT has basically got an F, right? Symantec, InfoSec, everyone says you're the most insecure class in the world. So everyone's out there doing Kickstarters and raising all this fundraising as a portfolio, as a company. What are we doing for security? Even a great company like August that raised 38, you had 3 hacks this year already. So how do you balance out the needs of security and product with the needs of fundraising? Because it seems like, as an industry, we're failing right now.
So I got asked a question on security earlier this week. I think there was a paradigm on security a couple of years ago that if you build it from the start, you have security, and then you check the box, you move on the other parts of MVP and your PLC. The newer type of security, because of the sophisticated folks that are out there and what's at stake, you have to every day wake up and really have part of your team that's focused on those issues, right? And so there are self-made issues, whether it's getting the right SSL certs, it's the issue of how you lock down the product, and then there's also the product area. What people don't talk a lot about is, one of the paradoxes of product design is designing for usability versus designing for security. So even in a setup wizard, you may make the choice to say, hey, that person doesn't have a access point that has a security key. We made the decision you actually have to have a password on that, but we've seen other companies out there that don't. And so that conversation is more, you have to do it every day, and you also have to embrace the folks that are out there. So like in our case, we've done stuff with the white hat folks and black hat folks, and we've also done a variety of other things.
So I was actually at the 50th celebration for the Stanford Computer Science Department just yesterday, actually the day before. And Dan Bonet, who's probably the preeminent person for doing computer security, he made a statement on stage saying that the only system that is secure is a system that is turned off. Okay. And he's absolutely right.
Actually, the battery has control.
Okay. And in fact, security is it's not something that, it's not a one-time thing, it's a constant thing. You have to, there's constantly people trying to break in, there's constantly things that you have to do to secure it. It's never perfect, and it's a trade-off between security and usability. And so at some point, you have to kind of factor in all of those trade-offs, but that doesn't mean that you stop caring about security.
So if you please join me in thanking our panel. And thank you very much for joining us.